There's something profoundly unsettling about photographs from the middle of the 1800s. When you examine images of Europe's greatest cities, St. Petersburg, Paris, Moscow, London, what strikes you first is their magnificence. The boulevards stretch wide and perfect. The architecture rises with flawless elegance. Every building appears pristine, restored to perfection. These cities seem frozen at the absolute zenith of human achievement. But then you notice it, the detail that transforms wonder into unease. The streets are abandoned. The plazas stand silent. The waterfront promenades are utterly deserted. It's as though you're gazing at elaborate film sets moments after everyone has left. And the question that forms in your mind is both simple and deeply disturbing. Where did everyone go? The standard explanation comes quickly from mainstream academia. Early photography required extended exposure times, sometimes stretching across several minutes. Anything in motion, whether person, carriage, or animal, would blur into invisibility or vanish entirely from the frame. Therefore, only stationary elements, buildings, bridges, monuments, could be properly captured on the photographic plate. This reasoning sounds plausible enough. It appears to solve the mystery neatly, but it disintegrates the moment we consider what city life actually consists of. Because urban existence isn't merely people rushing past. Cities pulse with countless stationary and slow-moving elements that long exposures would have captured perfectly. Picture a marketplace or a commercial district. Yes, customers move constantly, but the merchants remain at their stalls for hours on end. Where are they in these photographs? Where are the goods displayed on tables, the crates of produce, the barrels of beverages? All absent. And consider the transportation infrastructure. Cities couldn't function without cab drivers and their vehicles. The carriages and carts should be stationed at designated stands, waiting for passengers. The drivers would be sitting nearby, perhaps dozing. Yet, we see not a single vehicle, not one cart. We don't even see horses tethered to posts, calmly eating hay or drinking from troughs. These animals could remain stationary for tens of minutes, even hours. Beyond this, urban life demands constant logistical support. Firewood and coal were essential for heating homes and preparing meals. So, where are the orderly stacks of wood leaning against house walls? Where are the coal sacks awaiting distribution? Where is any of the household clutter that inevitably accumulates in inhabited spaces? The streets in these photographs appear clinically sterile. The absence of people is merely the surface of something far more disturbing. What's truly frightening is the complete absence of life's physical traces, the tangible evidence of human activity. These cities appear deliberately staged for photography, with every extraneous element removed, including the inhabitants, themselves, and even the smallest signs of their existence. This perfect vacancy demolishes the camera limitation theory and confronts us with a far more complex enigma. If people weren't simply missed by primitive cameras but genuinely weren't present, then what catastrophe could have emptied entire metropolitan centers? When the emptiness of the streets becomes troubling, examining the buildings themselves transforms that concern into genuine dread. Your attention shifts naturally from the vacant avenues upward to the building facades, searching desperately for any indication of human presence. And it's within these architectural details that an even more profound and darker mystery reveals itself. Windows, often called the eyes of a dwelling, appear blind and lifeless in these images. There's no suggestion of the warmth that daily habitation creates. We observe no gentle draping of curtains, no delicate lace in the windows, not even a modest potted plant on a windowsill. Those tiny touches that transform a structure of stone into a home are completely absent. The window openings gape like hollow dark squares, resembling the eye sockets of abandoned skulls. The balconies tell the same story. These small extensions of living space invariably serve as domestic overflow areas. People hang laundry there, place chairs for summer evenings, or store various items. The balconies in these old photographs are spotlessly bare. They function purely as architectural features without any practical purpose. No clotheslines, no furniture, no resident stepping outside for fresh air. The cities don't merely appear deserted. They look as though they were never genuinely inhabited at all. They convey the impression of an elaborate architectural model, meticulously constructed by a brilliant designer who simply forgot to animate it with life. This is a realm of beautiful facades, concealing absolute nothingness behind them. Yet even these troubling observations become insignificant compared to the most undeniable and persuasive evidence of these cities' lifelessness. You simply need to look higher still, to the rooftops. They bristle with hundreds, thousands of chimneys. The architectural style of that period makes it clear that every residence, every apartment, was heated independently. Fire served as the heart of every home. It cooked meals and warmed rooms during cold seasons. Smoke rising from a chimney was as fundamental a sign of habitation as breathing is to a living person. It proved that a hearth burned inside, that dinner was being prepared, that a family gathered in warmth and comfort. And here we discover the crucial revelation. From these countless chimneys, not a single wisp of smoke rises. Not a thin thread, not a thick column, nothing whatsoever. The sky above the rooftops remains perfectly transparent. Someone might suggest the photographs were taken during warm summer days when fires weren't needed. But this explanation crumbles under scrutiny. First, food preparation required fire year-round. Second, European capital climates are changeable, with cool days even in summer. But most critically, it's statistically impossible. To envision that in a city of tens of thousands or even millions of inhabitants, every single fire, whether for heating or cooking, was simultaneously extinguished is pure fantasy. It would require a complete synchronized cessation of all life. The absence of smoke speaks most eloquently. It tells us these houses aren't merely empty, they're frozen. These cities aren't simply sleeping, they exist in a deep, unnatural, suspended animation, as though their hearts stopped beating long ago. Against this backdrop of pervasive cold silence, any anomaly, however minor, that disrupts the pattern immediately captures attention. And such anomalies, though exceptionally rare, do exist. They flicker like dim lights in darkness, momentarily making you question the conclusion that these cities were entirely lifeless. Scanning the uniform rows of sealed windows, you might suddenly spot on one facade a slightly opened upper window. This simple everyday action seems impossibly out of place in a dead metropolis. The thought immediately forms. Perhaps someone is inside after all. Someone felt the need for ventilation and opened the window. This tiny detail potentially suggests not all structures are equally vacant. St. Petersburg presents an even more remarkable picture. In certain photographs, its renowned fountains operate at maximum capacity. Powerful water jets launch skyward from mythological creature mouths, glittering in sunlight and splashing loudly into granite basins. This spectacle itself demands sophisticated engineering support, sustained water pressure in the pipes, functioning mechanical systems. Yet surrounding this magnificence, absolutely no one. Not a single admiring observer, not one strolling couple, not a single child drawn to the cool spray. The magnificent fountains and ancient sculptures perform pointlessly, displaying their power to a completely abandoned city. This creates a surreal, almost staged impression. Finally, we discover a direct challenge to the notion of cold hearths. In one solitary photograph among hundreds, where the sky above roofs appears crystal clear, you can discern a barely visible phantom wisp of smoke rising from a chimney. It's so faint it could easily be mistaken for a plate defect or a scratch. But if we accept it as genuine smoke, it becomes the most significant evidence that life was, in fact, still flickering somewhere in the city. One hearth, one burning fire in a vast frozen metropolis. However, each of these puzzles carries a double meaning. These glimpses of hope might be misleading clues directing us toward incorrect conclusions. An opened window. Does it truly indicate presence? Or conversely, does it represent evidence of hasty departure when people abandon their homes, overlooking such minor details? Perhaps it's part of a sanitation procedure where structures empty for decades were being deliberately ventilated before renovation work commenced. The same applies to the operational fountains. For whom are they functioning? Perhaps not for residents who don't exist, but for engineers. This could represent a test operation, an inspection of the repaired water distribution system, a demonstration of completed work photographed for documentation purposes, not a scene from everyday existence. Even the solitary smoke wisp, if genuine, doesn't prove urban habitation. It could be smoke from a repair crew's fire or a watchman stationed to guard the empty district. One lit fire against thousands of cold chimneys only emphasizes the overall desolation. These scarce ambiguous details are insufficient to conclude the cities were populated. Rather, they create an impression of a transitional phase, a period of inspection and preparation for something forthcoming. When individual details coalesce into a larger pattern, an entirely different version of events begins materializing. The very style of these photographs suggests their primary purpose wasn't capturing architectural beauty or conveying urban atmosphere. The shot composition often lacks artistic sophistication. The photographer selects angles providing the most comprehensive view possible of streets, plazas, and building conditions. This resembles systematic, nearly official documentation more than art. The images feel like technical records, visual reports designed for careful examination. A crucial element of this documentation is the city's perfect condition. We observe not just emptiness, but impeccably maintained streets. The pavements are swept clean, no refuse exists, and building facades appear freshly repaired or at minimum brought to perfect order. The window openings, though empty internally, are fitted with new intact glass panes. No broken windows, no crumbling walls, no decay indicators that would inevitably emerge if a city were chaotically abandoned for extended periods. Conversely, everything appears as though enormous effort has been invested in restoration and preparation. These cities look as though they've been cleaned and prepared for a significant occasion. This interpretation explains many previously mentioned oddities. The sterile cleanliness, the complete absence of life's traces, the fountains running in test configuration. Everything fits perfectly within the concept of large-scale inspection. These photographs were likely commissioned by governmental agencies, possibly for national leadership. The purpose of such photography sessions could have been demonstrating the major city's readiness for a new phase, resettlement. Following some catastrophic event that caused their total abandonment, sufficient time had elapsed. Massive restoration work had been executed, clearing operations, structural repairs, utility system replacement. Now in the final stage, the results required documentation. The photographs served as visual confirmation. The properties are ready for occupancy. They were intended to demonstrate that cities were once again habitable. That's precisely why no people appear in them. The residents simply hadn't been relocated yet. They awaited decisions that would be made partially based on these reports. We're not observing a living city, but rather prepared housing inventory awaiting settlement. This explains the absence of personal possessions, the perfect order, and the general sensation of an uninhabited yet fully functional environment. The pictures captured a unique moment, the pause between a great restoration's conclusion and a great resettlement's commencement. But this raises the subsequent even more fundamental question. What kind of catastrophe could have necessitated completely evacuating and subsequently repopulating the world's largest cities? The search for answers takes us from architecture and photography into the grim records of climate history. Official chronicles document an event known as the Year Without Summer. It's dated to 1816, and its cause is attributed to the massive eruption of Mount Tambora volcano in Indonesia, which expelled enormous quantities of ash and sulfur into the atmosphere. This atmospheric suspension, functioning like a gigantic screen, blocked solar radiation for extended periods, causing severe, devastating cooling across the entire northern hemisphere. However, if you investigate deeper into old European sources and historical records, you can discover mentions that this period of darkness and cold persisted not 1 year, but a complete 3 years. 3 years without adequate summer, 3 years without sunshine. Today, we would classify such an event as nuclear winter, and it's relatively unimportant what triggered it, whether volcanic eruption, asteroid impact, or something else entirely. What matters is the reality that the planet was plunged into twilight. Evidence of this global cataclysm is preserved in European archives. They record dispassionately how food costs increased tenfold, how harvest failures occurred successively, triggering mass starvation and civil unrest. People fleeing this frozen apocalypse migrated en masse to the United States, anticipating better conditions there. But identical gray skies and cold awaited them there as well. This indicates the phenomenon was genuinely global, and its frozen grip had seized the entire northern hemisphere. And here the most disturbing question emerges. What was transpiring in Russia? It's remarkable, but in official Russian historical records, there exist virtually no accounts of this period. It's as though the vast empire existed in an informational void, and the global cataclysm bypassed it entirely. Proponents of the conventional interpretation would argue if no records exist, nothing occurred. But logic suggests the opposite. An event of this scale couldn't have had geographical boundaries. If Europe and America were freezing, then Russia, possessing a considerably harsher climate, should have suffered incomparably more. The absence of documentation could signify two possibilities. Either no one remained to document what was occurring, or the evidence was so horrifying that it was subsequently deliberately concealed or eliminated. Indirect yet very compelling evidence of the catastrophic situation in Russia is the migration direction itself. Why did Europeans flee across the ocean to America and not eastward to Russia, which was substantially closer? Only one answer exists: because conditions there were even worse. If famine existed in Europe, then in Russia, there was likely complete collapse of food supply systems. 3 years without sunlight for an agricultural nation means 3 years of total harvest failure. This isn't merely food scarcity, it's its complete disappearance. Stockpiles, regardless of size, cannot endure forever. The catastrophe that left cities empty began its countdown not in urban streets, but in frozen fields where grain never matured. When agricultural lands ceased producing crops, a merciless countdown mechanism activated. The first to experience it weren't people, but civilization's foundation at that time: horses. Hay reserves calculated to last until new grass appeared, in June depleted, but summer never arrived. A horse without feed transforms from the primary power source into a liability. One can presume that temporarily, people attempted feeding them with grain from human reserves, but this merely postponed the inevitable. Every bag of oats provided to a horse was a bag removed from a starving family. Eventually, the choice was made. The living transportation network, the empire's circulatory system, was slaughtered to feed its owners. With horses' disappearance, the final connection linking cities to each other was severed. In the capital, St. Petersburg, authorities couldn't have been oblivious to the disaster's magnitude. Imagine a desperate attempt to organize rescue operations. Where could food originate from? Only from southern regions where some state grain reserves might have survived. But how to transmit orders, for example, to Rostov-on-Don? In an era lacking telegraph, radio, or internet, the sole communication means was a physical carrier, a courier bearing a letter certified with seal and signature. This individual had to traverse more than 1,000 kilometers. Under normal circumstances, this was lengthy but achievable. Under new Ice Age conditions, it became a suicide mission. The roads, if they could still be called such, were buried beneath multi-meter snow layers. Unceasing blizzards obliterated any landmarks. Even if sufficiently hardy horses and their feed could be located, they simply couldn't penetrate through. A horse pulling a sleigh cannot advance through deep, loose snow. The path must be cleared or compacted. Now imagine thousands of kilometers of roads covered with 1.5 to 2 meter snow layers. With what resources could it be cleared? Manually with shovels. This is absolutely unrealistic. Officially, no specialized snow removal equipment existed. Even in our era, in the age of powerful snow removal machines and fossil fuel economy, one heavy snowfall can paralyze major highways for weeks. What can be said about that period? Thus, a complete and final transportation collapse occurred. Cities found themselves in genuine frozen blockade, isolated from the world, not by walls and armies, but by insurmountable natural force. Any attempts delivering food from southern regions were doomed. Caravans, if even dispatched, simply froze along the route, becoming frozen monuments to human effort's futility. Perhaps some criminal groups robbed them along the way, because under universal famine conditions, laws ceased applying. Large cargo volume delivery during summer was accomplished via rivers. But now rivers were bound by ice of unprecedented thickness. The empire, which had appeared monolithic and powerful, fragmented into isolated freezing enclaves. Each city was abandoned to its own fate, and that fate was terrible. Inside these frozen traps, the next most horrific act of this tragedy commenced. When cities transformed into frozen prisons, human nature, stripped of civilization's veneer, revealed its darkest aspects. Hunger is the great equalizer, erasing moral principles and social conventions. The first bastion to collapse was gastronomic propriety. What was previously considered inedible or food for the destitute became objects of desire. It's during such eras that recipes emerge which subsequently, during times of abundance, might be romanticized and termed delicacies. Frog legs, snails, cheese covered in thick mold. All these are remnants of desperate survival struggles when any calorie source became invaluable. All cats and dogs were consumed. Rats became prized prey. But when even this meager sustenance depleted, humanity crossed the ultimate boundary. Deep within the Paris catacombs, among neatly arranged bones of millions of people, researchers discover gruesome evidence from that era. On certain human remains exist distinct marks left by human teeth. This is silent yet eloquent proof that in hunger's agony, people resorted to the most terrible of all possible food sources. In this struggle for survival, social structure completely disintegrated. The strong and ruthless formed packs, transforming into genuine gangs. Their targets were food storage facilities, wealthy household supplies, any location where food stocks might still remain. City streets became arenas of silent and brutal warfare, where the right to survival was determined exclusively by physical force. In this atmosphere of total collapse, those still possessing strength made the only correct decision: flee, not to other cities which were identical traps, but away from civilization into forests. The forest, which had previously seemed wild and hostile, now became the final refuge and hope for salvation. There, one could attempt hunting animals or capturing birds, and most importantly, firewood existed. Trees provided means to create fire, to warm oneself and avoid freezing to death in this frozen world. A mass exodus from cities commenced. The young and strong departed, leaving behind the elderly, the sick, and children who were incapable of making this arduous journey. Cities rapidly accumulated bodies of those whose lives had concluded. No one remained to bury them. They remained in their cold apartments, on snow-covered streets, in public structures. 3 long, dark years passed, and one day the sun returned. Winter's frozen grip loosened, and snow began melting. But this long-awaited warmth brought not salvation, but a new, even more terrible catastrophe turn. Thousands of bodies preserved by frost began decomposing. Cities filled with unbearable stench. Meltwater mixing with decomposition products poisoned wells and springs. Widespread epidemics commenced. Decaying remains attracted wild animal packs, which became the deserted streets' new masters. Living in these cities became impossible. They had transformed into gigantic burial grounds, infection breeding sites. Even the few who managed surviving hunger and cold were compelled to remain far away from them. Decades had to elapse before nature and time could perform their work, and the first attempt could be made bringing these cursed locations back to life. Following the city's physical decay, the epidemics, and the return to barbarism came the most profound and irreversible consequence: the great chain of human memory's destruction. In any catastrophe, the most vulnerable perish first, the elderly and infants. But in this tragedy, their departure was more than merely statistical. It was a double blow to civilization's very essence. With the elderly departed living memory, the carriers of knowledge, traditions, crafts, family histories, and life experience itself, every elderly person whose journey concluded in a cold house was like a library burning to the ground, taking with them into oblivion unique knowledge that could never be transmitted. Simultaneously, the future also vanished. Children and the infants lacking immunity and strength to combat the elements departed this world, leaving behind a gaping demographic void. The few children who miraculously survived became a lost generation in the most literal sense. Left without parents, without grandparents, they matured not knowing their past. Who were they? What was their family name? Who were their ancestors? What was this enormous and now frightening city about? All these questions remained unanswered. Their memory was a blank slate upon which only vague, nightmarish images of cold, hunger, and loss were imprinted. They knew neither the old faith, nor the old laws, nor the old culture. They were perfect material for forming a new society. You could instill anything in these rootless children: a new history where no terrible winter existed, a new language cleansed of old concepts, a new nation built upon ruins of a world they couldn't remember. Perhaps this phenomenon gave rise to the precise and chilling Russian expression, Ivan who doesn't remember his kinship. This wasn't merely a figurative insult, but a literal description of an entire generation of people who matured without a past. It was a social diagnosis assigned to a society that had suffered amnesia. This tragedy's scale was so monstrous that any subsequent government would be interested in consigning it to oblivion. To admit the great capitals had perished from hunger and cold, that civilization had regressed to cannibalism, was to admit the old world order's complete failure. It was considerably easier and politically more expedient to create a new myth, a myth of wild, empty lands that were newly settled and constructed by wise and strong rulers. History wasn't merely rewritten, it was created anew on collective memory's scorched field. And in this context, the old photographs acquire their true final significance. They cease being merely a mystery or historical curiosity. They become the primary silent witness to that great catastrophe and the great forgetting that followed. They are the sole surviving proof, a document from that terrible era that escaped censorship and editorial revision. Looking at these perfectly clean, restored, and absolutely empty cities, we're not simply seeing streets without people. We're seeing the last incorruptible page from a history chapter that an entire civilization decided to tear out and burn so it would never be remembered again.